They took $94,000 from our joint account while I was unconscious on an operating table, and my wife Sandra looked me in the eye 3 days later and said the sweetest thing she had ever said to me, which was that she had no idea how it happened, and that the bank must have made a terrible mistake, and I almost believed her, because after 29 years of marriage, you want to believe the person sitting beside your hospital bed, holding your hand, is there because they love you and not because they are calculating what comes next. And what Sandra did not know, and what her boyfriend did not know, and what nobody in that hospital room knew, except me, was that I had spent 26 years as a forensic accountant for the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and I had tracked money across 17 countries and had testified in 41 federal trials and had personally recovered over $200 million in stolen assets, and I did not retire because I ran out of things to find. I retired because I had found enough, and I wanted mornings that were quiet, and coffee that was hot, and a life that did not require me to count other people's lives for a living. And then Sandra gave me one more thing to count. And I want to start by telling you about Sandra before I tell you what she did, because the portrait matters. And Sandra and I had been married for 29 years, and for most of those years the marriage had been solid in the specific way that marriages are solid when two people have survived difficult things. Together, we had survived the death of our first child, a son named William, who lived 4 days, and we had survived my years of travel and absence, and the particular loneliness that comes with being married to someone whose work is always classified, and we had built something real together, or I believed we had, and the distance started 3 years before the surgery in the specific way that distances start, which is so gradually that you adjust to each new degree of separation without registering. That, the total distance has become something significant, and Sandra had a friend named Richard who was a financial advisor, and Richard came too. Dinner twice, and then 3 times, and then Sandra was having lunch with Richard on Tuesdays, which became Tuesdays and Thursdays, and I am a forensic accountant, and I understand patterns, and the pattern of Sandra, and Richard was not the pattern of professional colleagues. It was something else, and I did not confront Sandra immediately, and I want to explain why, because this is important in my profession. You do not confront a subject until your evidence is complete, because premature confrontation destroys the case, and I had not been wrong about a case in 26 years, and I was not wrong about this one, and the cardiac procedure was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in September, and it was not open. Heart surgery, but it was significant enough to require general anesthesia and a surgical team, and Sandra drove me to the hospital and sat with me while they placed the IV, and she held my hand when the anesthesiologist arrived, and the last thing I saw before the medication took me under was Sandra's face at the edge of my vision, looking at me with an expression I could not read, and I went under, and the procedure took 3 hours, and I came out of it well, and I was in recovery for 1 night, and the morning after the surgery, I asked the nurse for my phone, and I checked my banking application the way I checked it every morning out of professional habit, and the joint checking account which it contained. $94,000 the morning I went into surgery contained $4,012, and I looked at the screen for a long time, and I felt something that was not anger, it was recognition, the specific recognition of a forensic accountant who has seen this pattern in 17 countries and 41 federal trials, and I called my personal attorney Robert from my hospital bed, and I told him what I was looking at. And Robert said, "Gerald, how are you feeling?" And I said, "I am feeling like I need you to come to the hospital immediately." And Robert came that afternoon, and I told him everything, not just the account balance, but the full picture Sandra Richard the Tuesday lunches the pattern I had been documenting for 18 months in a notebook I kept in my home office, because old habits do not retire even when you do. And Robert listened without interrupting the way good attorneys listen, and when I finished he said, "Gerald, you kept records." And I said, "Robert, I spent 26 years keeping records." And he said, "Good." And we spent 2 hours at my hospital bedside building the beginning of a case. And what Sandra did not know was that the joint account she had emptied was not the account that mattered, and the account that mattered was a separate investment account I had established in my own name alone 14 years earlier, when a senior agent I respected told me something I never forgot, which was, "Gerald, always keep money that is only yours, not because you do not trust your spouse, but because trust is not a financial strategy." And I had listened. And the account had grown quietly, and Sandra had never asked about it, and I had never mentioned it, and it contained $430,000 that Sandra and Richard had not touched, because they did not know it existed. And 3 days after the surgery, Sandra sat beside my hospital bed holding my hand and told me the bank must have made a terrible mistake. And I looked at her and I said, "Sandra, I would like you to tell me about the transfers." And her expression shifted by exactly the fraction that told me she had not expected me to know about them. And she said, "What transfers?" And I said, "Sandra, I am a forensic accountant." And she said, "You are retired." And I said, "Sandra, the transfers from the joint account on the morning of my surgery." And her face did something complicated. And then she said, "Richard needed the money for an investment opportunity." And it was going to be such a surprise. And I almost laughed, because in 41 federal trials I had never once heard a better example of financial fraud framed as a romantic gesture. And I said, "Sandra, I need you to leave the hospital now." And she left, and I called Robert, and I said, "Robert, it is time to move." And Robert moved, and what followed was the kind of case I could have built in my sleep, because I had built cases like it for 26 years, the forensic trail Sandra and Richard had left was not subtle. It was the trail of people who believed their target was too sick or too old or too sedated to look, and the transfers went from our joint account to a personal account Sandra had, opened 6 weeks before my surgery, and from there to a brokerage account Richard controlled, and the purpose was not an investment opportunity. The purpose was that Sandra and Richard had been planning to inform me, after my recovery, that the money had been lost in a bad investment, and that these things happened, and that we would get through it together, and the plan would have worked on someone who did not know how to trace money across 17 countries, and it did not work on me, and the recovery of the $94,000 took 11 weeks through a combination of Robert's legal filings and my own forensic documentation of the complete money trail, and Sandra and Richard both faced civil judgments that required full restitution plus penalties, and Robert filed a criminal complaint with the district attorney's office that resulted in charges of wire fraud and financial exploitation, and I am sitting in my home office this morning with coffee that is hot and mornings that are quiet, and the $430,000 in the account that Sandra never found is still there, exactly where the senior. Agent told me to put it 20 years ago, and if you have ever been told that your professional experience expired the moment you left the office, I want you to hear this 26 years of finding money that people tried to hide does not stop being 26 years of finding money the morning you retire it simply waits in a notebook beside your desk for the moment someone gives you one more case to close.